Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Talk to Walk podcast. If you want to view the video version of this episode, you can check out the link in our description that will take you to our YouTube channel to do so, or visit secondstudentsclinton.com for more info. Well, everybody, welcome into this week's episode of the Talk to Walk podcast. My name is Tyler Baker. I'm your host, and with me today, I have a buddy of mine from the ATL Atlanta area, Mr. Heath Hatmaker. Heath, dude, we're so glad that you're on with us today.
Honored to be here. This is fun.
Yeah, man, it's a good time. We've had your mom on the podcast already.
I know, and apparently her episode's the best. So
yeah, she's killed it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm nervous now. I wasn't nervous before, but now I am.
I mean, no pressure, right?
I mean, she's great. Everyone should watch her podcast. If you're watching this and you haven't watched hers yet, go back and watch hers, and then come back if you want and watch this one.
Yeah, right. So today at the table, kind of our premise for the podcast is we believe that the conversations had at this table are beneficial for those that as we talk, we help others walk better as they listen to our conversation. Cool. And today, being student pastors ourselves, which we'll get into what you do in a little bit, we're talking about accountability and what it looks like to have that in and around your life, both personally, professionally, and also even within the scope of ministry. And so before we get into the conversation, Heath, you're from the area.
I'm from right here.
You're literally from here.
Born and raised here. So
At Second.
At Second, was at Second. I think my mom and dad started at Second when I was like 6 months old.
Okay.
And was here until I went to college. And so, I've been around for a very long time at Second.
Awesome. We love it. And I've been here not near as long as that. So pretty much you were born in the sanctuary is kind of the way it goes.
We had the old building back on Fowler Street. And I think I could right now draw you a map of every inch of that building.
Really?
I mean, I know every single corner, every closet. I used to do this thing to my parents when they would talk for too long after church, where I would leave them and go hide somewhere. And I was like, you know what? If you're not going to leave when I'm ready, I'm not going to leave when you're ready.
Right.
And so that's not a good example. Don't do that to your parents. But that's what I would do. And so I found every single closet everywhere. I was hiding behind the bookshelves with the hymnals.
The redbacks?
Oh, yeah.
Redbacks only?
Some good stuff. Some choir robes are back there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, good times. But I've been around Second for a very, very long time.
Yeah, so then you went to college and you kind of relocated your life. Kind of tell us a little bit about yourself with that.
Yeah, so I went to college in Virginia at Liberty University. Loved it there. And then did an internship at a church in Chicago called Harvest Bible Chapel. And I was actually a worship leader. And when I was there, they were like, hey, man, you're pretty good at this, but I think that you would be even better at student ministry. And I never considered that, but I was like, okay, man, I'll pray about it. And so did one more year of college. And then between my junior and senior year, I actually moved to Chicago and started full-time there as a student pastor and finished my degree online.
Okay.
So was there for 4.5 years. Met my wife, Colleen, there. That was a church that when she got saved in high school, that's where she started going to student ministry. So we were very connected there. Loved our time there, loved all the people there, but decided that it was time for our family to do something different. And from there, moved to Atlanta, where we are at right now. And I lead middle school at Passion City Church in Atlanta, and then help kind of lead the creative for student ministry as a whole. So,
okay, you have a daughter.
I do. Yeah. I have a 15-month-old Willa, and she had her 15-month-old appointment yesterday. And I'm happy to report that she is above 70% in every single metric. And they asked if she knew any words. And I said 15. And they were like, what? They're like, she's supposed to know 5.
Oh my gosh.
So she's a genius.
Yeah.
So
she gets it from you, right?
Yeah. I'm just hoping that she makes enough money to buy me a house, because I don't have that much money. So that would be nice.
Right. Yeah.
So,
you got a while for that. I mean,
we got time.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe she'll play softball at the University of Tennessee. God, do it, please.
Yeah. So growing up in the area, man, I'm sure that was a culture shock going from Clinton, Tennessee, Knoxville area to a massive college like Liberty.
Yeah.
But then even from there to a metropolis is in Chicago.
Yeah.
But what gets me is that you went from a metropolis in Chicago to like a metropolis in Atlanta.
Yeah. It's been crazy. It's very different. Atlanta is a very different city than Chicago. And I think that what I'm realizing is the people are different. I think that something that I didn't know until I got to Chicago is what it's like to be in a place that culturally not everyone just says they're a Christian at the grocery store so that there's not a weird conversation that follows, you know? Right. So like, Chicago is very, very heavily Catholic. A ton of people in Chicago would just say like, no, I'm not spiritual at all. Mm-hmm. And that would not be a strange thing to say.
Yep.
And so I think even coming to Atlanta, which I didn't realize growing up in the South, I was like, Atlanta's this big city. Mm-hmm. That's incredible. And Chicago is like 10 times bigger than Atlanta.
Really?
Don't fact check me on that, but it's way bigger.
See, I would never, like, I've always viewed Atlanta as the metropolis.
Exactly. So being from Tennessee, from the South, I was like, oh, Atlanta, huge. And Chicago's like top 5 city in the country, and Atlanta's like top 30 or something. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. I mean, Chicago is massive. But yeah, I think that even the way that I view student ministry and the way that life happens in the city is so different than like in Clinton, in the surrounding areas here. And I think that there are pros and cons to both. And so I think that I've been trying to navigate how to relate to students in that context as well as what I grew up in, which is very different.
Right. And so growing up in the Bible Belt, you know, I'm from Kentucky, so I'm not too far north.
Yeah.
You know, the premise that it's really a joke at this point is that everybody pretty much knows about Jesus in some way. Sure. If you go Kentucky down. But what I've discovered is that though they may know about Jesus, do they know him personally?
Yeah, totally. And I think that when you know about Jesus, you know, if you ask someone, especially in the South, do you know about Jesus? I think you're right in that the answer is probably over 90% would say yes. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's the level of, like you said, well, I know about Jesus because that's the guy that my grandma used to talk about.
Right.
And like I saw his picture sometimes. Or, yeah, Jesus, like he's the one that, you know, does this cool thing. He was a miracle guy, right? And I think that you run into in the South, the difference that I've seen in Chicago, someone was willing to say, yeah, like I've heard some about Jesus, or no, I don't. I've seen the church. Is that what you're talking about? Where I think that in the South, in some way, there's been an insecurity created around not knowing Jesus. And so the answer is, yeah, I know Jesus. Are you a Christian? Yeah, of course. And I think that answer comes so quickly because so many people in the South would be shocked if you weren't. Mm. And so I think that that's where we, you know, I've with students, with, you know, adults in the South learning to recraft questions. And so it's, for me, less, do you know who Jesus is, and more, who is Jesus to you? Yeah. And do you have a relationship with Jesus, and what does it look like? And I think that's where you get, do you know Jesus? Yes. Do you follow Jesus? No, not at all. And I think that's where, the more that you dig, I think that we've got to keep driving further and further as we talk to people about Jesus, for sure.
Yeah, and I think the topic of today's talk with being accountability, I think that comes in full bore with that. I mean, especially being in student ministry, the typical answer is, like you said, yeah, I've heard of him, but when you really dig, there's a lot of questions that I've found that a lot of church people still have, and I've discovered that the lack of accountability in a lot of people's lives determines where they are in their relationship with Christ, truthfully, because when you have people around you that are constantly speaking life into you and speaking encouragement and pushing you closer to Christ, it's a lot easier to say, I am a Christian, I'm a follower, than those that don't have that. And so I think, you know, with student ministry, especially, the dynamic shifting. And I think it's cool to see students digging deeper, but also I think it's cool to see people that are beginning to dig deeper with groups around them that have accountability. So to kind of jump into our conversation, you know, just a few thoughts, you know, I want you to share from what's on your heart, what God's speaking through you. For you, let's kind of talk about your personal life for a minute. What were some ways that you began to develop accountability rhythms in your life early? Not in ministry, but like pre-ministry, middle school, high school. Yeah. Let's kind of start there.
Yeah, I think that it helped that I was raised in the church and around it. Right. But I think that there was a few pivot points for me. I think that consistency was huge for me. I think about like Gary Disney is a guy that is around Second a ton, and that name may not mean anything to you, but for me, that was the guy that was like my leader, my small group leader. I mean, I think it was all through high school, if not a little bit in middle school. And I just remember there were weeks where, man, I showed up after football practice and was sweaty and smelly and not contributing to conversation and probably being more distracting than helpful. But I remember every single week him and Shane Woods being in a room, wanting to talk to us and wanting to listen.
Yeah.
And so I think that anytime you want accountability and you want someone to be able to see your life at that level and speak into it, you got to show up regularly. And that's not just like to youth group. That's like showing up in a friendship, in a relationship, and being consistent. So I think about those moments. And I think one of the biggest things for me that shifted in high school was getting to a point, being around the church, growing up in the church. I knew a lot of the people in the church. I was like the kid that like was the mascot of the church, probably like running down the hallway at Awana, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's Carrie and Candy's kid." Like, that's fun. And so I knew a lot of people at a level. I think this is a different cultural thing too. I knew a lot of people at a level of like the surface, but not a ton of people, even in my youth group, even in my small group, knew anything that was happening below a surface level for me.
Yeah.
And I think that something that I found in high school was that my vulnerability led to intimacy with people. Mm-hmm. And so I think that as we walk into accountability, there was a few guys, I think of 3 guys my age, Tyler, Kenton Sulfridge, and then Alex Fletcher. And I think about one of our leaders that used to be youth pastor here, Austin. And those were the 4 guys in high school that I finally, I think for the first time, was like, hey man, I'm just gonna like kind of open up the book. I'm gonna lay all my cards down on the table, and I just have to trust that you're going to hear those and receive those without judgment, without ridicule or anything like that. But I think that vulnerability, the moment where I said, hey, here's who I really am, that led to actual intimacy and accountability with those guys.
Yeah. And
so I think that when I always growing up wanted to like, and being in the church in high school, I always wanted people to know about my life, like I think that many of us would say, I wish that people knew the thoughts that I have, or I wish that someone was walking with me in this, but like, I would never tell them that I'm thinking that.
Right.
And so I think that that's something that like a big piece for me was I've got to let them know what's going on so that they can be a person of accountability for me. I think that's step number 1. It was for me is like, okay, I want people to walk with me, then I've got to tell them that I'm struggling with this.
Right.
Because I can say as much as I want accountability. And if I'm unwilling to let people see what I'm asking them to hold me accountable for, then I can't expect that. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the big shift for me. Even early in high school was I've got to find at least a few people that I'm not trying to be somebody I'm not worried about if they're going to judge me. I trusted them. I knew that they weren't going to go and like, hey, did you hear Heath is doing XYZ? Like I knew that they were going to be a group of people that I could say, here it is. What do I do? How can you help me? Can you pray with me? Can you check on me?
Yeah. And man, I'm sitting here thinking back as you're telling stories just in times in my life where I've had that, but I also think too, with accountability, I've always been taught this, that accountability breeds authenticity. Yeah. That when you have someone that you are accountable with, intimacy, that word, I love that word because, you develop that relationship, but ultimately I think accountability leads to more intimacy with Christ as well, because you can be vulnerable with the God who knows you and made you. That's one level, but when you're vulnerable with other people who are just as flawed as you find out that you're not as messed up as you think you are.
Totally.
But I think the whole premise of accountability in today's age is that people are so afraid that accountability leads to judgment. Yeah. And people think, oh, I can't say this because this person's going to view me differently. Oh, this person's going to know, okay, I struggle with this junk, and they may not, and they're going to go tell somebody. Yeah. And so I think finding those key people, like you said, in your life are so pivotal to change not only you as a person, but your relationship with the Lord. And so kind of for the students that may be listening to this, maybe the college students, that don't have that group, what would be some ways that you would encourage them to find that like you did?
Yeah, I think that, I think it's scary. Let's be real. I think that it's scary to open yourself up to that. I think that one of the enemy's biggest lies is that you're alone in something. And so, I mean, I don't have any statistic to back this up, but like how many students would say college or younger, I'm struggling with, pornography, but I know that no one else in my friend group, there's no way that anyone else that I know or that goes to my school could be struggling with this.
Yeah.
And I just think that that is a lie that the enemy would tell someone, is that you're broken, you're gross, you can't tell anybody this. And the problem is that there's 50 people sitting around thinking, I'm so alone in this. And they're sitting in a class every day together.
Yep.
And I think that there's so much power in just being honest. So I think that my advice would be, I mean, it is scary, and I don't want to act like it's not. And I don't want to just be like, well, go start telling everyone your life story and don't lie to anybody. Tell them all your sin and all of this. But I think that for me, there's like, even now moving to a new city as an adult and a dad, I'm trying to kind of test the waters with some people. And so I would encourage you to find someone that has potential. So like right now, I've got probably 3 or 4 guys in my life in Atlanta that I feel like can be that level of an accountability partner or person for me. And it's not there yet. And so I'm not coming in guns blazing first thing like, hey man, you'll never believe what I think and what the things that I've done or the things that I've said. And so I'm not going to that level. But I think that if we keep using like the show your cards analogy, I think that every time I have a meeting with these 3 or 4 people, which I'm scheduling regularly, you got to be consistent, like I said, every time I see them, I'm laying down like one more card.
Right.
And saying, yeah, this is what happened with Colleen and I. And this is the thing that we went through at our old city, old church, and just starting to show more and more and seeing, okay, is this person listening? Is this person checking up on me? Are they proving their character? Are they telling me things about other people? You know, anybody that comes to you and is like, you'll never believe what so-and-so did. You're like, well, I'm not going to talk to you
Right,
about it because you just blabbed all about them. So I think that as I have those conversations, for me, it's not all gas. It's like, let's ease into this. But if you sit around and just wait for someone to come to you, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and authenticity is something that I believe is scarce in people because they are so afraid of that side of the blab. Like, it's like we, talked about with accountability. A lot of people view it as, okay, I'm going to throw my cards on this table and everybody's going to take a card and go tell everybody about that card I just laid down. And so I think we have to work on how do we get past that? How do we get through that? And that's a good tactic, having people that you don't go all gas. Yeah. And that's wisdom, because a lot of people, let's be honest, as pastors, we deal with students when they come in, it's the gas tank's on fire.
Yeah.
And they're just, here's everything I'm dealing with, and they trust us. And I think that's also part of the positional thing, but then they see us as, okay, as authentic as we can be, as real as we can be, they'll be that real with us, if not more.
Yeah.
And so I think that's wisdom in finding that crew. So for you, how has accountability within having those groups in high school and now as an adult, how has that helped you walk through life? Like, what has been the benefits of accountability for you?
Yeah, I think that, gosh, so many benefits. I think that one of my favorite things about accountability, and this is a personality thing that I have, and I don't know that not everyone's like this, but I have decently hard skin and can receive feedback. And if anything, I am not self-aware enough to see what's going on, but can receive it if someone else says it. And so I think about times in college specifically where those guys that I mentioned were in a spot where they were like, hey man, are your eyes open? Like, do you see how this is affecting your relationship with God, your relationship with your family, your relationship with your friends? And a lot of the time, my answer was, no, I don't see that. But I think that if you walk in with a little bit of hard skin, I think the thing that's hard about accountability is that you're asking for people to help you, to point out the things in your life that aren't looking like Jesus, that aren't helping you look more like Jesus, and saying, hey, my life, I'm giving you a position of authority, which I think it has to be accountability.
Yeah.
I think that if you're asking people to help you and then they say something to you and you're like, hey man, who asked you? You. Like that's what I thought we were doing. And so I gave them authority and I said, hey, I'm going to assume the best of you. Assume that you're not just trying to roast me or you're not judging me, but I'm going to have a soft enough heart that says, I'm going to receive it. I'm going to listen. I'm going to pray about it myself. I remember a moment where I was in a relationship that wasn't going well. And one of my people that I was in accountability with just said, hey man, I don't know if you see this or not, but I don't think that this relationship, if you say that you want to be a man of God, if you say that you want to be a pastor, which I'd already said that I wanted to be, they said, I think that you need to choose if you want to be those things or if you want to keep being in this relationship because that relationship's not making you look more like that. And it was tough to hear. But I remember walking away and praying and thinking and evaluating. And I was like, I think he's right. Like this isn't good. This isn't healthy for me right now. And so it was something to say, I trust that you're being genuine and not just trying to go off or anything. And I'm going to actually take action based on what you just said. And so I think that that was some of the biggest things in my life have been, when you're swimming in the ocean and you can't see the shore, it's like, I think about my daughter. So we're doing swim lessons right now for Willa.
Yeah.
And when she's in the middle of the pool, like she's like really holding on to me and is kind of like looking around for good reason. She's a baby. But for me, I'm like, the side of the pool is like 3 feet away. And like, I'm holding you, you're okay. And I think that it's helpful if we can take some analogy like that and say accountability helps us zoom out and say, oh, I'm just right by the edge of the pool. And I think that when you see the bigger picture, it helps you evaluate yourself and say, is this actually helpful for me? And so the path that I'm walking on, the decisions that I'm making, when you're in the middle of the waves, when you're in the middle of the pool, it's hard to see the reality of what's going on. And so I think the accountability helps zoom that out a little bit and you say, oh, yeah, that doesn't fit with what I want. And I couldn't see that when I was in the middle of the pool by myself.
That's good. That's a very, very good perspective because, I think, I know as a man in my own world, my own mind, a lot of times we as men, speaking to the men here, we don't think we need accountability because we think we've just got it figured out, right?
Yeah.
Naturally, we're fixers. Naturally, we're in very reclusive with our struggles because we have this level of pride that, okay, I'm a man, I'm strong, I'm tough. Culture says I have to be this way, so I don't need anybody speaking into my life because I just got to figure it out on my own.
Sure.
And man, I've seen so many men crash and burn because of that. Even myself, I'm going back to seasons of my life, even in ministry where I didn't have that, and I burned, I crashed hard.
Yeah.
Not in a moral failure way, but in a, oh my gosh, I am miserable because I have nobody speaking into my life. So I've got to find that.
Yeah.
And man, that's been a journey for me just because coming from a church that was a smaller town than where I'm at now in Clinton, it was throw your mask on, come to church, don't talk about your stuff, move on.
Totally.
And when I finally began to get real with people and began to really say, okay, hey, here's what I'm carrying. Not only did I find that, okay, I'm zooming out, like you said, I'm seeing how close I am to the edge, but I also discovered, okay, my pride has to die in order for me to have true accountability in my life.
Yeah.
That it's no longer what I think is, okay, this is good for me, even though it's royally messing up my life. I have to allow those people to speak into me. And that comes from relationship. I believe it comes from knowing someone, trusting someone. And so for you, in this season of life, you've got a baby, you're married, you're in a new city. What has been the toughest part for you with accountability?
I think, I think I already mentioned a little bit, like starting over and feeling like you had people and you still have phone numbers. Like we're thankfully in an age where I can FaceTime the guys that know me and know every part of who I am and just be like, hey man, this thing is coming. But I think that there is something special about being in proximity and going to coffee and sitting and looking face to face with somebody in the same way that like this conversation is more powerful than if we would have done it via Zoom because we're sitting together. And I think that we were made that way. It's not a bad thing. And so I think that the hardest part for me right now is feeling like, okay, I need to, it's nice when you feel like someone has the full picture, and when you're starting over, you're like, oh yeah, like you don't know who I am, like you don't know about high school or college yet. Like when you meet someone, you just assume that they've always been like that.
Right.
And so I think that going back and kind of starting over is the hardest part for me, and finding people that, like you said, I think that are pushing me towards not judgment, but that are pushing me towards, hey, like I hear that, I see that, and the goal in our relationship is for both of us to look more like Jesus. And so I think that it's really hard to trust people immediately, but I think that I personally am having to take that step into like, this is worth it for me to be honest and to trust and hope that you're going to receive this in the way that is helpful for me. I think that, like you talking about guys being prideful, like I get that 1,000%. And I think that that's guys and a lot of girls. I think that that's everyone wants to be put together. And I think that's where, when you admit that you're broken, accountability can help push you toward repentance and towards life. And you have to let people help you get to there instead of assuming that it's going to push you towards judgment or towards defeat. I think about, this is bad podcasting, but I'm looking at my Bible. I think it's 2 Corinthians. Now I'm on the clock and I can't find 2 Corinthians. Okay, here it is.
Go back to Bible drill days, man.
I know. I used to win Bible drill candy at Second Baptist Church, so no big deal. Okay, yeah. So Paul is writing to this church in Corinth, and he's talking about, he's kind of calling them out. Good for him. Like he has that authority spot. They have to trust him. And he's talking about, I love this. He's talking about how in 1 Corinthians, he says that letter grieved you, though only for a while. And then he says in verse 9, 2 Corinthians 7:9, he said, as it is, I rejoice, not because you were grieved, but because you were grieved into repenting. For you felt a godly grief so that you suffered no loss through us. And then verse 10 right here, I think this is like my arch for accountability. It says, godly grief produces repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death. And so I think as you are walking into conversations, I think that my thing is trying to find people that are willing to call out the stuff in my life, but that the goal would be that it would lead me to repentance and lead me to salvation and lead me to life. And the moment that I open up to someone and it feels like their motive is instead to lead towards judgment or towards death and grief, I feel like that's a pretty clear line where I say, okay, I told you, which is not a bad thing that people know more about us. Like everything doesn't have to be filtered and perfect. And I think that when you show a card to someone, if they are like, oh my gosh, you did that. Like, what do you think? Or whatever. Okay. I took a step. You responded in that way. That's not my fault, but my response can be, hey, I'm not going to keep showing you things because we went the way towards worldly grief and death. And I'm looking for people that when I show them the things that I have, it leads towards biblical grief, which leads to repentance and life and salvation. And so I think that that's right now the hardest part, is trying to find the groups of people and trust them to the point where I start to show and then evaluate, like, is this a relationship that's going to push me towards salvation and life and repentance? Or do I need to kind of back out of that because I felt pretty quickly like someone was judging me and it was leading towards grief or towards death?
Yeah. Yeah, man, I think leading into the whole point of this conversation, the goal is not to let people say, okay, I don't need that in my life. I think you and I both are sitting here having a conversation about things that have helped us.
Yeah.
And how much accountability has really been influential in our life. And so I love, even if you go even further in scripture in Colossians, Paul, when he prays for his people, he never prays for anything other than for them to know Jesus more.
Yeah.
That's his goal, is that they would grow in the knowledge and the depth and the wisdom of the gospel, that they would look more like Christ. And I think true, authentic, biblical accountability, that's a mouthful, is doing nothing out of your own selfish ambition of flesh to make someone feel like they're less than, because of what they've done, but to understand that we are all less than.
Totally.
And because of what Jesus has done, we all have redemption in that, and there's life in that. And I love that perspective, man. So for you, what would be some things you would maybe say, maybe some notes you have, some thoughts you've had on accountability? Because we've been able to think about this for a couple of weeks now. We've been trying to, get this episode done. And what would be some key takeaways that you would give to someone listening that maybe has accountability, but it doesn't look like it's giving life? Maybe there is none. Maybe they have really good. How could they make it better? What are some takeaways that you could give just on a general level of accountability and how to have it and why to have it and really what it looks like when it's positive?
Yeah, I would say, I think that what you just hinted on, I think is I agree completely in that I don't think this is a hot take. I don't think that you can be following Jesus in the way that the Bible describes without people knowing you at that level and without you giving them a position to speak into it. I don't think that we see any person in Scripture that follows Jesus in a silo alone. I don't think that it exists. And so I think that, it's the whole point of the church. The reason that it's so important that we're gathering is because we're gathering together as a body of believers. And so I think that the first thing that I would say is if you are feeling like it doesn't apply to me or it's not worth it, I couldn't disagree more with that. And I hope that comes across gently via podcast. But I just think that let me say it this way. I've tried it and it really didn't work for me. And so if you are trying it, I would just encourage you to evaluate, is this working? And so I would encourage every single person to take the steps necessary to find accountability. And I would say, be gentle with yourself in it. I don't think that you have to have it tomorrow. And so if you're listening to this and the Spirit is like convicting you to have accountability, praise the Lord. Like, it's nothing that we've come up with to do that. But don't expect like that you're going to text someone and tomorrow morning go and like share your whole life story. And now you've got your best friend in the world that's going to hold you accountable. Like, give yourself some time. I've lived in Atlanta for a year now, and I am still at the 50-yard line of accountability. And so I've got potential. I've had some conversations, but I'm not where I want to be yet. And that's not because I'm a bad person or a bad Christian or I've done something wrong. It's because it takes time. And so be gentle with yourself, give yourself time. And probably the third thing I would say is that accountability is pointless if you're not willing to change. And so if you really want accountability, you've got to be the type of person that says, I want this from other people, godly people that are going to speak into my life. I think it's so powerful to have accountability that's your age, accountability that's older than you. I think, finding someone in your group, but also your youth pastor or someone else in your life, I think it's so great. I finally got to the point later in college and where I'm at now, like my dad and I are having conversations where we're able to hold one another accountable towards ministry and towards life, and finding different people in different spots of life. But I think that the point is you got to give them authority to speak into your life and call things out. And from that, if you want accountability to be effective, you have to receive what they say. And don't take it as gospel truth, because we're humans. I can see things wrong. But take what they say and pray and consider and write it down and look at it on a note card and say, is this true? God, show me if this is true. Show me if this is true. And if you want accountability to be effective, you have to be willing to change anything in your life that doesn't look like Jesus. And so I think that would be the third thing, would be, if you're going to do it, receive what is said and be willing to change everything. If that means you need to move or quit a job or, not play football anymore or whatever comes from that, I think that for us to look like Jesus, we have to hold the temporary lives that we have wide open and say, God, chisel away any part of this that doesn't help me look like you. And I think that that's something that accountability helps us look more like and helps us get to, is that people are looking and saying, hey, I don't know if you know, but that doesn't look like an ear, like your artist chiseling. That doesn't look right. And you can take a few steps back and say, you're right. Let me chisel that away. And so I think that's what's been most helpful for me in accountability, is that I've gotten to the point, not every time, but a lot of times where I've said, okay, I'm going to receive what you say and I'm going to break up with this girl. I'm going to change this major. I'm going to do whatever you said. I'm going to stop being friends with those people because you're right. That's not making me look like Jesus.
Yeah. And man, when you're in it and you can't see that 30,000 foot view, that's sometimes the hardest conversations to have.
Yeah.
But I think that's where relationships become stronger, and your dependence on the fact of, okay, I cannot do life on my own becomes even more of a reality. Is that when I have a group of people that care enough about me to tell me I'm wrong, fix it, just like you're sitting here saying you have in your life, that changes everything.
Totally.
And man, I'm so for accountability. I mean, obviously being married, your wife's kind of your built-in best friend in a way, which is fun. But even within that scope, there's still things that you have to talk about outside of that scope with other people that they can see from a different perspective. And I think that's such wisdom. I mean, man, I cannot say it enough. I stress to our students, find a circle, plug in, and invest.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean just speak into someone else's life. It means let them speak into you. Because, man, I mean, I've only seen accountability be beneficial in my life. I've never had a negative experience, thankfully. I know some of you listening may have, but for me, it changed me. I mean, that's the whole reason why I'm in ministry now, is because I had a pastor that was accountable to me and said, I see this in you, and I didn't see it in myself. And here I am 12 years later. Shout out to David Bullock, my pastor when I was 15, because he said, I see this in you, and I know you don't see it in you. Let me help you see it. Yeah. And it changed everything. And so, man, that's such an important part of our life. So wrapping up the discussion, man, I don't want it to end. It's one of those episodes. You just want to keep going. What would be your final thought on accountability? No holds bar.
Man, I would say, I honestly think, kind of looping back, just like it's necessary. I think that anyone that feels like they've got things put together, none of us do. And I think that's what you said earlier too, about like the beautiful thing is that you don't have to be good, and you're not. None of us are. And so I think that when you realize how broken you are, how broken everyone is, it enhances the beauty of the gospel. And when you get view of your brokenness by yourself or with the help of an accountability partner, and you see who Jesus is and what he's done for me, then at that point, like, I think Romans 12 talks about offering your bodies as an act of worship. And a literal translation of that is that it's the logical thing to do. When I look at my life, when I look and I see Jesus, the only thing that makes sense for me to do is offer everything that I have as a living act of worship to him. And so I think that that's the whole thing. For accountability to work, you have to be amazed at the beauty of the gospel. Otherwise, you're just like, I'm going to fix myself. And that's not what accountability is. Accountability is, I am going to use my brothers and sisters to see what God has done and can continue to do through me. So I think I love our church tries to loop everything back to the gospel, and that's it for me. So I would say accountability in view of the gospel is what will change, and not just accountability to fix yourself.
So good, man. So good. Well, man, I can't say enough. Thank you for making the drive up from the big city of ATL to small town Clinton, hometown.
That's right.
Man, it's been so good having you on the episode today. I would add to that one last thought of, if you don't have accountability, find it. And if you can't find it, find us. Because I honestly believe that there are people that are willing and able and that have the desire to speak into the lives of those that may be listening, into your life, into my life, that we're not tapping into. Sure. And we have to get to that place to be able to say, I need this. It's this important. I'm going to make the effort for it. So wherever you are, wherever you're listening from, if you're watching, trust us, accountability works because it's necessary. But thank you, Heath, again, man. Thank you for the discussion today. It was so enjoyable. Wherever you're watching from, listening from, be sure to do us a favor and rate it, review it, share it. This is content we believe that can help other people walk better in their life, and follow us along as we continue to journey on. But we'll see you guys next week for our next episode of Talk to Walk. Have a great week. See y'all soon.